You're lying in bed, replaying an argument you had 6 hours ago. Except this time you say the perfect comeback. Out loud, in your head, in your own voice, delivering the line you wish you'd said in the moment. And here's the strange part you've probably never stopped to question. Who exactly is talking? Because that voice sounds like you, uses your vocabulary, even your sense of humor. But is it actually you, or is it something your brain built and handed you so convincingly that you never thought to ask for ID? The answer to that question goes a lot deeper than it has any right to. Let's start with something that might genuinely surprise you. Not everyone has that voice at all. For decades, most people quietly assumed that constant inner monologue was simply what it meant to have a mind, that everyone narrates their life internally, all day, the same way you probably do. But research led by psychologist Russell Hurlburt at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, using a method called descriptive experience sampling, where participants wear a beeper that goes off randomly throughout the day and immediately report exactly what was happening in their mind at that instant, found something that upended that assumption entirely. Across decades of sampling, Hurlburt's research suggests inner speech occurs, on average, in roughly 1 out of every 4 sampled moments for a typical participant. And critically, some individuals report almost constant inner narration, while others report experiencing very little verbal inner speech at all, relying instead on wordless images, emotions, or what researchers describe as unsymbolized thinking. In other words, the voice in your head that feels so universal, so obviously human, might not even be a universal feature of human minds. Some people are apparently just quiet in there. This quiet minority turns out to have a name and a growing body of research behind it. More recent work building on Hurlburt's sampling methods has proposed the term anendophasia to describe individuals who experience little to no inner verbal narration at all, relying instead almost entirely on wordless thought. Interestingly, some researchers have drawn loose comparisons between this and a separate, better-known phenomenon called aphantasia, where individuals report an inability to voluntarily generate mental images, suggesting that the internal, subjective texture of human cognition may vary far more dramatically from person to person than most people ever assume, simply because nobody has direct access to anyone else's inner experience to compare notes. You've spent your entire life assuming everyone else's mind runs roughly the same internal software yours does. There has never been a reliable way to check that assumption, until researchers started actually asking people, systematically, what's happening in there. So if not everyone has this voice, where does it actually come from for those of us who do? This is where developmental psychology gets genuinely fascinating. Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, working in the 1920s and 1930s, proposed a theory that has held up remarkably well. He observed that young children frequently talk out loud to themselves while playing or solving problems, narrating their own actions in real time. Vygotsky argued this private speech wasn't random babble. It was children literally thinking out loud, using language as a tool to guide their own behavior. And crucially, he proposed that as children grow older, this out-loud self-talk doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It becomes internalized, quieter, faster, until it eventually turns into the silent inner voice adults experience, without ever noticing the transition happened. If Vygotsky was right, that voice in your head isn't some mysterious separate entity. It's literally childhood speech that never stopped. It just learned to whisper. And if inner speech really is internalized language rather than some pre-linguistic essence of self, there's a natural follow-up question. What happens to people who grew up speaking more than one language? Do they get 2 inner voices, or does one quietly take over? Researchers studying bilingual inner speech have found genuinely varied answers depending on the individual. Some bilingual people report their inner voice shifting language depending on context, thinking in whichever language matches the situation, the people involved, or even the emotional register of the thought, while others report a dominant default inner language regardless of setting. Some studies on bilingual cognition have suggested that people may even experience different emotional intensity or distance when processing difficult topics in a second language compared to their first, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as the foreign language effect, where moral and emotional decisions can shift slightly depending on which language is doing the internal narrating. If the language your inner voice happens to be using can measurably change how emotionally close a thought feels to you, that's a fairly strong hint that the voice isn't some fixed, unchangeable essence of who you are. It's a flexible tool built from whatever linguistic material you happen to have loaded into it. But here's where it gets stranger. Modern brain imaging suggests this internalized whisper isn't just a metaphor. It's structurally, physically real. Researchers studying inner speech using fMRI, including work associated with psychologist Alain Morin and others in the field, have consistently found that when people engage in deliberate inner monologue, brain regions associated with actual speech production, including Broca's area, which is heavily involved in producing spoken language, show measurable activation, even though no sound leaves your mouth. Your brain, in a very real sense, is rehearsing speech it has no intention of releasing. Some researchers have even documented tiny, barely perceptible movements in the vocal cords and tongue during intense inner speech, subthreshold whispers your body almost produces but catches at the last moment. Which raises an unsettling question. If the silent voice in your head is quietly firing the same machinery as actual talking, how silent is it really? There's an everyday version of this you've probably experienced without ever labeling it. Right now, as you read these words, there's a reasonable chance a faint version of your inner voice is silently reading them aloud in your head, a phenomenon researchers call subvocalization. Studies using electromyography, which measures tiny electrical signals in muscles, have detected subtle activity in the muscles of the throat and larynx during silent reading, particularly with complex or unfamiliar material, suggesting the brain is quietly recruiting the same speech machinery used for actual talking just to help process written language. Speed reading techniques that attempt to train people out of this habit exist precisely because subvocalization tends to cap reading speed at roughly the pace of spoken language, even though your eyes are physically capable of taking in text much faster. Which means, in a very literal sense, part of your brain has been quietly voicing this entire script to you as you've been reading it, without you ever consciously deciding to let it. Now, here's the part nobody talks about. This voice might not just be describing your thoughts. It might be doing something closer to running your life. Psychologist Charles Fernyhough, who has spent much of his career researching inner speech through Durham University's Hearing the Voice project, has argued that inner speech plays a genuine functional role in self-regulation, helping people plan, evaluate decisions, and maintain self-control. Classic developmental research, building on Vygotsky's original framework, has shown that children who use more self-directed private speech while working through a difficult task tend to perform better on measures of executive function and self-control than children who use less. If that connection holds into adulthood, and a growing body of research suggests it does, then that internal narrator isn't just commentary on your life happening in the background. It might be one of the actual tools your brain uses to keep you organized, motivated, and behaviorally on track. The voice isn't just watching the show. It might be running parts of the production. This connects to one of the most famous experiments in psychology, even though it's rarely discussed in terms of inner speech. Walter Mischel's delay of gratification studies, beginning in the late 1960s at Stanford, famously placed young children alone in a room with a single marshmallow, offering a second marshmallow as a reward if they could avoid eating the first one for a set period of time. Follow-up analyses of these studies found that children who successfully waited weren't simply exercising raw willpower. Many were observed actively talking to themselves, singing, or narrating strategies out loud to distract themselves from the temptation directly in front of them. In other words, some of the earliest, clearest evidence that self-directed inner speech genuinely helps regulate behavior came from watching 4-year-olds essentially coach themselves through resisting a marshmallow, using exactly the kind of internalized private speech Vygotsky had described decades earlier. The tool wasn't just theoretical. It was visibly audibly at work in a room full of extremely tempted preschoolers. But wait, if the inner voice is this useful, this integrated, this deeply you, why does it sometimes feel like it's arguing against you instead of helping you? This is the counterexample worth sitting with, because it complicates the tidy story of the inner voice as a helpful internalized parent guiding you along. Anyone who has ever lain awake spiraling in self-criticism, hearing that same internal narrator list every mistake they've made in painful detail, knows the voice doesn't always feel like an ally. Researchers studying rumination and negative self-talk have found that excessive, repetitive negative inner speech is strongly associated with anxiety and depressive symptoms, and some cognitive behavioral therapy approaches are explicitly built around identifying and restructuring exactly this kind of internal dialogue. So which is it? Is the inner voice the helpful internalized coach Vygotsky and Fernyhough describe, or is it capable of becoming something closer to an internal bully? The honest answer, based on the research, is both, because it's not actually a separate entity with its own agenda. It's a tool built from your own language, your own memories, your own learned patterns, which means it's just as capable of reflecting your harshest self-judgments as it is your wisest self-guidance. The voice doesn't have a personality independent of you. It has your personality, including the parts you'd rather it didn't borrow. And this negative capacity is precisely why an entire branch of contemplative and clinical practice has grown up around learning to relate to the voice differently, rather than simply believing everything it says. Mindfulness-based approaches, drawing on techniques with roots in Buddhist meditation practice and increasingly studied in clinical psychology research since the 1990s, often center on a specific skill: noticing a thought, including verbal inner speech, as an event happening in the mind rather than as an automatic statement of fact. Researchers studying mindfulness-based cognitive therapy have found this kind of decentering from inner speech, learning to observe the voice rather than automatically obey it, is associated with reduced relapse rates in people with a history of recurrent depression. That distinction, hearing the thought versus believing the thought, turns out to be one of the more clinically powerful ideas to come out of decades of inner speech research, and it only makes sense once you accept that the voice is a tool generating output, not an infallible narrator reporting objective truth. Now here's where things get genuinely unsettling, because some of the most revealing evidence about the inner voice doesn't come from people who have too much of it. It comes from studying what happens when the brain's storytelling machinery gets split in two. In a series of experiments conducted from the 1960s through the 1980s, neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga and his colleagues studied patients who had undergone a surgical procedure severing the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, typically done at the time to treat severe epilepsy. Because language processing is heavily concentrated in the brain's left hemisphere for most people, Gazzaniga found he could show information exclusively to a patient's right hemisphere, which had no direct language access, and then ask the patient's left hemisphere, the one doing the talking, to explain a behavior it hadn't actually witnessed the reason for. Over and over, patients confidently invented plausible-sounding explanations for actions their conscious, speaking mind had no real information about. Gazzaniga eventually named this function the brain's interpreter, a module seemingly dedicated to constructing a coherent verbal narrative out of whatever fragments of experience it has access to, whether or not that narrative is actually accurate. If a piece of your brain is specifically built to confidently narrate explanations it's partly making up, that raises an uncomfortable question about the voice narrating your life right now. How much of what it tells you is observation, and how much is convincing, well-intentioned fiction? Here's a pattern interrupt worth sitting with. The same brain structure that tells you why you're anxious about tomorrow's meeting might be running on roughly the same machinery that once confidently explained a stranger's random hand gesture as a deliberate choice it never actually witnessed. There's a related finding worth mentioning here too, because it directly measures how much time this internal narration actually occupies, and what it does to your mood while it's running. In 2010, psychologists Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard published a large-scale study using a smartphone app that randomly pinged thousands of participants throughout their day, asking what they were currently doing and whether their mind was wandering from that task. The results were striking. People reported that their minds were wandering, engaged in something other than the task at hand for roughly 47% of their waking hours. And critically, people reported being measurably less happy during these wanderings. Self-narrating episodes than during moments of focused attention on whatever they were actually doing, regardless of how pleasant or unpleasant the current task was. The researchers summarized their own findings with a line that has since been quoted constantly. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind, which means that internal narrator, so often assumed to be quietly keeping you company, may in practice be pulling you out of roughly half your waking life and making you feel worse while it does it. But what about people whose inner voice doesn't just misfire occasionally? What about when it seems to break away from the self entirely? This is where the research connects to something far more clinically serious. Some individuals experiencing auditory verbal hallucinations, a hallmark symptom in conditions like schizophrenia, report hearing voices that feel distinctly external, not internally generated. Despite brain imaging studies suggesting significant overlap between the neural activity involved in normal inner speech and the neural activity present during these hallucinated voices. Researchers, including those affiliated with Fernihu's Hearing the Voice project, have proposed that in some cases what's being experienced may be a kind of inner speech that has lost its normal tag, identifying it as self-generated, causing the brain to misattribute it to an external source. If that theory holds even partially, it suggests something remarkable and a little vertigo-inducing. The difference between a private, comforting internal thought and a frightening external voice may not always be about the content of what's said. It may sometimes be about a subtle labeling error in how confidently your brain identifies something as coming from you at all. The line between my thought and a voice speaking to me might be thinner and more mechanical than most people would ever guess. So here's the question this whole investigation eventually forces you to confront. If the voice in your head can be absent in some people entirely, internalized from childhood speech, physically rehearsed in your vocal machinery, capable of turning against you, produced partly by a narrating module documented to confidently fabricate explanations, and in rare cases even mislabeled as coming from somewhere outside you, then what exactly are you calling you when you say that voice is yours? This is where the research edges towards something closer to philosophy than neuroscience, and it's worth pausing here rather than rushing past it. Many researchers in this space, including Fernihu himself, tend to resist the idea that the inner voice is either fully you or some entirely separate imposter. Instead, the more accurate framing appears to be that the self isn't a single unified narrator sitting somewhere behind your eyes, dictating a script. It looks more like a process, an ongoing act of construction, built moment to moment from memory, language, emotion, and prediction, with the inner voice as one prominent, useful, occasionally unreliable output of that process. Rather than its source, a child talking to themselves while stacking blocks becomes an adult solving a problem silently in their own head. A brain rehearsing speech it never releases becomes the quiet companion you mistake for pure observation. A split-brain patient confidently inventing a reason it never witnessed becomes a reminder that certainty and accuracy are not the same thing. A person lying awake at 2 a.m., convinced the voice listing their failures is delivering objective truth, is really just hearing their own language turned against their own well-being. A person who hears no inner voice at all still thinks, still plans, still feels, proving the voice was never actually the mind itself. Only one of the mind's many possible costumes. None of this means the voice is fake, or that you should distrust every thought that crosses your mind starting today. It means something more precise and honestly more useful. The voice is a tool your brain built, largely out of language it absorbed from the people who raised and surrounded you, refined across childhood, repurposed for planning and self-control, occasionally hijacked by anxiety or rumination, and prone, like every storytelling system, to filling gaps with confident guesses rather than admitting uncertainty. It is undeniably shaped by you, built from your history, running on your specific brain. But shaped by you and objectively, infallibly you are two very different claims, and only one of them is actually supported by the evidence. And maybe that's actually good news, once you sit with it long enough. If the voice were truly unchangeably you, then a harsh inner critic would be a fixed feature of your identity, permanent and unmovable. But if it's closer to a tool built from language and habit and childhood patterns you never consciously chose, then it's also a tool capable of being retrained, softened, or at least recognized for what it is in the moment it's speaking. Therapists, meditation teachers, and researchers studying self-talk interventions have spent decades demonstrating exactly this. The content and tone of inner speech can shift with practice, which would make very little sense if that voice were some immovable core of the self rather than a flexible output your brain generates over and over, based on whatever material it's been given to work with. Which brings us back to that argument replaying in your head at 2 a.m. The perfect comeback finally arriving 6 hours too late, delivered in a voice that sounds exactly like yours. You now know that voice is doing something closer to rehearsal than truth-telling, reconstructing a moment using memory, language, and a narrator module that has never once been shy about filling in gaps with confident fiction. It's not lying to you exactly. It's doing what it was built to do, the same way it's always done, since you were a small child narrating out loud while stacking blocks nobody was watching. You're not the voice. You're the one who eventually learned to listen to it.